All right, listeners, ready to dive deep into the 2025 election because there's a new player on the field and they are shaking things up.
That's right. We're talking about democracy first, and they've got some big ideas we got to unpack.
Huge, some might even say radical. And we're going straight to the source, their own materials, to figure out what they're all about.
We've got their 12-point plan, their manifesto for a lucky country, and even their sensible conservatism charter.
Plus some independent analysis to help us see if they're the real deal or just all talk.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Who is Democracy First?
Yeah, paint us a picture.
Well, they're brand new, not even registered yet, calling themselves sensible conservatives.
Sensible conservatives. Now that's an interesting label, right? What does that even mean in Aussie politics?
Yeah, it's a bit of a head-scratcher. Are they trying to snag voters who think the liberals have gone too far right? Or are they after labor voters who aren't so keen on progressive policies?
It's a clever strategy for sure, positioning themselves as the middle ground, the voice of reason.
Exactly, the grown-ups in the room trying to fix the mess in Canberra, as they put it.
And they're not holding back. They even want to get rid of career politicians. Catchy slogan. But can they actually do that?
But that's where things get tricky. I mean, the right to run for office is pretty fundamental to our democracy.
Yeah, it's in the Constitution, right?
Exactly. So any attempt to block experienced politicians from running would likely face some serious legal challenges.
And let's be real, experience isn't always a bad thing. Governing is complex. It takes know-how.
Absolutely. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Speaking of potentially problematic policies, let's talk immigration, because Democracy First is proposing a full-on moratorium until infrastructure services and integration catch up.
This is a hot-button issue, for sure, and this stance could make some serious waves.
Absolutely, and it's not just controversial. It might actually be illegal.
You're right. Australia has international obligations when it comes to immigration. A blanket moratorium could clash with those, and even our own Racial Discrimination Act.
So this moratorium could land them in hot water on multiple fronts. Makes you wonder if they've really thought this through.
Yeah, do they have legal experts advising them? Have they considered the potential blowback? For our listeners out there, this is something to consider. Are these policies well thought out, or are they just shooting from the hip?
Okay, so we've got this party, a bit of a mystery, really, with a questionable slogan and a potentially illegal immigration policy. What else is on their agenda?
Well, one thing they're pushing hard, and it's in both their 12-point plan and the Lucky Country manifesto, is directly funding education and childcare to parents.
Sounds good in theory, right?
Yeah.
More choice, more control for parents, but is it really that simple?
On the surface, it sounds great, empowering parents, promoting school choice, but the reality is much more complicated.
How would that even work?
For starters, it raises legal issues. Our education funding system is governed by a whole bunch of legislation. Just handing money to parents could create chaos and potential for misuse.
I can see that happening pretty quickly. And who would oversee how that money is spent? Are there any accountability measures?
Exactly. Those are the questions that need answers. And then there's the whole separation of church and state thing. If parents can use these funds for religious schools, doesn't that blur the lines a bit?
So maybe not such a simple fix after all. All right, let's look at another one of their big promises, 2 years of paid parental leave.
2 years at home with a newborn, who wouldn't want that?
Sounds like a dream, but again, I'm guessing there's a catch.
You got it. It's a generous proposal, no doubt, but the big question is, how are they going to pay for it? New taxes, cuts to other programs. And what about the impact on businesses, especially small businesses who would have to cover the costs?
Right, it's easy to make promises, but without a solid plan to back them up. It's just empty words.
Exactly. And that lack of detail is a recurring theme with democracy. First, they're big on bold statements, but light on specifics. And for voters trying to make informed decisions, that lack of transparency is a real concern.
All right, last policy for this part of our deep dive. They talk about building independent defense capabilities.
Sounds tough, sounds patriotic, but is it realistic? And does it align with Australia's best interests?
Yeah, because building a truly independent defense industry would be incredibly expensive and time-consuming. It's not something you just snap your fingers and achieve.
Exactly. It's a long-term project with massive implications, and it needs a clear strategic vision, not just political posturing.
So we've covered a lot of ground with Democracy First. Bold ideas for sure, but also some potential red flags, especially for voters concerned about legality, feasibility, and transparency.
And that's what we're here for, to help you cut through the noise and make informed decisions.
We'll be back in just a moment to continue our exploration of Democracy First and delve deeper into some of the potential consequences of their policies. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, listeners. We've been digging into Democracy First's platform, and, well, they're not shy about wanting to change things up, are they?
Definitely shaking things up. But all this talk of sweeping change makes you wonder, could their approach actually backfire and make things worse?
That's the big question, isn't it? They're basically saying, give us the power and we'll bulldoze the system. But what happens if they actually get that power?
Yeah, what then?
Well, we could end up with gridlock chaos, maybe even a constitutional crisis.
Hold on, a constitutional crisis. Isn't that a bit dramatic?
Maybe, but think about it. They want to overhaul long-standing institutions like how we fund education and the structure of our defense forces, and they want to do it all really fast.
I see what you mean. Rushing these changes could have all sorts of unintended consequences. And don't forget, Australia has a history of hung parliaments.
Yeah.
Those situations can be volatile, even without a party like democracy. First, throw a wrench in the works.
Exactly. Throw in their ambitious agenda and their disregard for potential legal issues, and it's a recipe for instability.
So they're light on details, potentially reckless with the law, and possibly a catalyst for instability. Any other red flags we should be aware of?
Well, the big one is transparency. We still don't know much about who's really behind Democracy First.
Yeah, where's the money coming from? Who are their candidates? What are their qualifications?
It's like they're saying, trust us, we know what we're doing, but without more transparency, it's hard to know what their motivations are or who they're really accountable to.
And in a democracy, that lack of transparency should be a major concern for voters.
Absolutely. Voters have a right to know who they're voting for and where their money is going without that the door is wide open for corruption and shady dealings.
Okay, so we've got potential legal issues, instability, lack of transparency. Let's zoom in on some of their policies that raise some serious questions, like their plans to reform the ABC.
The ABC has been a political football for years, but Democracy First is incredibly vague about what they actually want to do with it.
Yeah, they say they want to revise the charter, but they don't say how they reduce funding, change the editorial direction, limit its independence.
It's all very hush-hush, which is worrying. The ABC is a public broadcaster. It should be accountable to the public, not to the whims of whoever's in power.
Exactly. And that's where the lack of transparency really hurts. Are they trying to protect the ABC or undermine it? Voters deserve to know.
Absolutely. And this lack of clarity is a pattern with democracy. First, they're good at slogans and promises, but not so good on the details.
So we've got potential legal landmines, a recipe for instability, a worrying lack of transparency, and vague plans for a major media institution. This is starting to feel like a political thriller.
Well, every election has its drama, but this one feels different. Democracy First is tapping into real frustration with the political system, but are they offering real solutions or just more of the same?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's not an easy one to answer. There's a sense that things need to change, but is democracy first the answer?
That's where we need to be critical thinkers. Listeners, don't just buy into the slogans and promises. Look deeper. Ask the tough questions and think about the consequences.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back soon to wrap up this deep dive and leave you with some final thoughts to consider as we head into this election season. Stay tuned. And we are back, listeners. We've been taking apart Democracy First's platform, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, hasn't it?
Yeah, they're definitely not afraid to make waves, but with those waves come a lot of questions.
Big questions, especially about some of their policies like that immigration moratorium. It's still bugging me.
Yeah.
They want to hit pause on immigration until we're all caught up on infrastructure, services, integration, all that stuff.
Sounds good on paper, but the reality is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, is it even legal?
That's a major red flag. Australia has international obligations. A blanket moratorium could violate those, not to mention our own Racial Discrimination Act.
So it's not just a policy shift, it's potentially breaking the law.
Exactly. It's a risky move, and one that could have some serious consequences. Imagine the international backlash, the damage to Australia's reputation.
Yes. Not a good look. Okay, so the immigration moratorium's a no-go. What about that education and childcare funding idea? I'm all for empowering parents, but handing them a pile of cash and saying, go educate your kids, just seems risky.
I hear you. It sounds appealing, but our education system is so complex, this kind of overhaul could create chaos and inequality.
Exactly. Who manages the money? How do we ensure it's used properly? What about kids with special needs?
And what about public schools? If parents can use this funding for private schools, we could see a mass exodus from the public system, making things even harder for those who can't afford private education.
So a well-intentioned idea with potentially disastrous consequences, it makes you wonder if they've really thought this through.
Governing is more than just good intentions. It takes planning, understanding the complexities, and considering all the possible outcomes.
Okay, one last policy. The ABC, they're big on reforming it, but they're incredibly vague about what they actually want to do.
Right, revising the charter, they say, but what does that even mean?
Yeah, it's all very secretive. Makes you wonder what they're trying to hide. Are they going to slash funding? Censor content. Stack the board with their own people.
All valid concerns. The ABC is a public broadcaster. It needs to be independent, free from political meddling.
Absolutely. A healthy democracy needs a strong and independent media.
Couldn't agree more. It's crucial for a free and open society.
So we've covered a lot of ground with democracy. First, they've got some bold ideas, but also some serious red flags. What's the takeaway for our listeners as we head into this election?
Be informed, be critical, be engaged. Don't just take politicians' words at face value. Dig deeper, ask the tough questions, do your own research.
Yeah, democracy first might be tapping into that feeling that things need to change, but will their solutions actually make things better or worse?
That's what we all need to consider. Sometimes the most appealing solutions have the most dangerous consequences. So let's be thoughtful, be critical, and most importantly, make our voices heard.
Well said, listeners. We've reached the end of our deep dive into democracy first. Thanks for joining us. And remember, as you head to the polls, think about what Australia would look like in 5 years if democracy first gets their way. What will we celebrate and what might we regret? The choice is yours. Make it count.